Hi, friends, welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is going to be completely different from what I'd originally planned. With the recent events in America, and as I learn more about how police brutality and the oppression of minority groups takes place not only here, but around the world, I thought it's only imperative for all of us to learn more about these issues, donate, contribute, and understand our privilege, so that we all can have a net positive impact on the world. As MLK once said, in the end, we will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And I thought that at least through this podcast, we all will choose not to remain silent. So I really hope that after listening to this episode, if you haven't acted already, you will be inspired to act. And if you have acted already, you'd be inspired to go a step ahead. Today I have with me my friend Jacob Neill, a great friend of mine who just graduated from UC Berkeley as a political science major, and he was kind enough to talk about what we need to talk about today. I became friends with Jacob in an empathy class that I took at Berkeley, and really that class was all about bringing people together from different ethnic and racial backgrounds and just having a conversation to understand each other's perspectives better, but mainly to realize how race, ethnicity, privilege, and other things influence your worldview and your success. So, Jacob, thank you so very much for taking the time out today. I really appreciate it. And I guess I'll just start off by asking you, please tell us about yourself. How was it like growing up black in America? And how have your experiences been so far?
Well, first, thank you for having me join you today. I'm excited to be on here today. I've never really done a podcast before, so
Oh, yes.
first time for everything, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm from the Bay Area. I was born in Berkeley, California, ironically. Lived in Richmond, California for the first 5 years of my life. But my mom, she's a single mom, and, I'm a twin as well, so she knew she couldn't raise two twin boys in the inner city of Richmond, so she made the decision to get us out of there, and she moved us out to the far East Bay in a city called Antioch, California. But more specifically, I grew up in a small subsection of Antioch called Oakley, which is a really small city with about 30,000 people. And when we first moved out there in 2002. It was mostly it was heavily populated with, migrant workers, people from Latinx descent, and then also a lot of white working class Americans. So growing up initially, it wasn't abnormal for my brother and I to be the only two black people in our class, from like kindergarten all the way up to really fifth grade. We were typically the only black people in our class, but due to gentrification, housing discrimination, and the tech industry booming in the Bay Area, a lot of people are now leaving the Bay due to rising prices and are moving out to, areas such as Sacramento, Stockton, and Antioch. So I would say the latter half of my childhood was a lot different. There was a lot more black people in my classes, a lot more Latinx folks in my classes. Matter of fact, my high school was majority Latinx.
And this was after 5 years old, right?
Yeah, and this is after 5 years old. So, and a matter of fact, if you look at a statistic from a case study that someone did from the year 2000 to 2015, about 14,000 black people moved from Richmond, Berkeley, Oakland alone out to Antioch, California.
And these are all due to housing discrimination and price rises and all of that.
Yep, and gentrification and whatnot. So the Antioch community definitely wasn't ready for the influx in black folks, which has led to cases of issues with the police, schooling not knowing how to essentially cultivate and educate their black students, and just a lot of like racial tensions. Growing up, I definitely dealt with a very big amount of microaggressions. People oftentimes would say, "Wow, you're so well articulate for a black person.
Wow.
You don't act black." And even once in a while, like in high school, I was referred to as the N-word. And then I also ran cross country, and cross country is a predominantly white sport, so I dealt with a great amount of racism and microaggressions in that sport as well. people would, criticize me for how I carried myself. And it was very frustrating, because I wasn't necessarily well equipped to deal with, those racist encounters. And it's simply because I think a lot of people never understood what the definition of racism truly was back then, and I don't think a lot of people truly know what racism is now. I think oftentimes we think because you throw out a racial epithet or use belligerent, damaging language, then that considers you racist, right? But in actuality, especially after my time at Cal, I realized and have learned that no, microaggressions such as, oh, you're so well articulate, or you don't act black, things of that nature, those are inherently anti-black, because it literally revolves our world and our society around whiteness, which is strongly correlated with the ideology of white supremacy. So I think, growing up, I definitely dealt with a lot of tug and pull on that end. I was a really good student, which also I think emphasized the racist encounters I always came across, because I was often the only black person like in my AP classes. I was in this program called the GATE program, from elementary all the way up to high school, and I was often the only black person in those situations. So I definitely dealt with a lot of like issues such as that, feeling isolated, and I always knew something wasn't right. I would always ask myself, even at a young age, like, why am I the only black person here? And I would go home and tell my mom, Mom, I realized I'm the only black person, and she would just tell me, well, you're really smart, Jacob. You're just really ahead of the curve, and just keep your eyes on the prize and just continue to work on the books. So I never really thought of it too much from a race perspective, but once again, that also shows how problematic racism has disseminated across our society, because it wasn't fair that I was the only black person in a lot of those situations. And I think it's because, once again, we haven't empowered, our fellow black students, our fellow black residents, about their own intellect, right? And even people saying you're so well articulate is damaging, because just because black people talk different, they want to, denote that as idiotic, not intelligent, which is also very damaging and problematic. So those were a lot of things I dealt with growing up, and a lot of my black friends that I did have kind of, fed into that mantra. We kind of just assumed that that's the way it was. Didn't have to question it, just deal with it. Okay, yeah, someone calls me whitewash, whatever. I would be lying to you, though, if I said that didn't upset me. Matter of fact, I had to call out people in the latter half of my high school time. I'm not going to say names, but someone said, oh, I like this person because they're actually black. And then they would say it right in front of me, and I would ask them, what does that supposed to mean? And mind you, this was a white person saying these comments. So I don't understand how a white person can evaluate what blackness is and what being black truly is when they can't resonate with it, which is also something we're seeing now. A lot of white people want to assess and analyze the way race works in this country when they don't have to deal with racism. They don't have to deal with being on the oppressed side of white supremacy when they're the beneficiaries of it. So I think what we're witnessing right now is really good in terms of finally engaging in that dialogue and realizing what ends of the spectrum everyone is in on. And I'm not going to necessarily disown a person because of their ideologies, but I'm definitely going to distance myself if they're not willing to educate themselves on this matter.
Wow. I think that was a very, very full and well descriptive answer of your entire story, and thank you so much for sharing all of that. I'm curious, at what point did you begin to realize, or at what point did it just struck you that you were quote unquote black and others were quote unquote not black?
Well, I think I've always have been knowledgeable of my blackness. Race wasn't something that wasn't like sheltered in my household, thankfully. My father's from New Orleans. He grew up in one of the worst parts of New Orleans, actually. And he's of Creole descent. He's actually white passing. So a lot of people didn't realize he was black. So he dealt with a lot of microaggressions in that regard too. In the South, there's this thing called the one drop rule, where if you have any black in you, you are considered black. And I know in our current time that doesn't seem as relevant, but in the South it still is, and
I think globally also it is considered to a certain extent true that if any one of your parents or grandparents is black, then you're considered black. And I think globally that is also the case. Am I correct on that?
I can't necessarily talk on the international scope of it, but I know specifically in America it's heightened. I think if you can get away with people not knowing that you have Black heritage from an international perspective, you'll be okay. But I know, like in South Africa, for example, in America, for example, you had to literally put in your identification that you had Black in you, and especially in the Jim Crow era, which is the time that my dad's parents grew up in, and that my dad partly grew up in. They had to still deal with that type of segregation, that type of institutionalized racism in terms of like targeting people who were indeed Black, even if they didn't come across as Black or were perceived physically as Black.
Yeah.
My father definitely made it a point to talk about his Blackness from a very early age, and he was intermittently in and out of my life. We're on good terms now, but growing up, he always was adamant, like, don't let people ever tell you that I'm not Black. He's like, I've definitely faced racism myself, even though I am white passing. And my father would never obviously articulate it as white passing, but now I know it was white passing. And my mother is, phenotypically, she looks Black. My mom is Black. So it was never an issue when, they would see my mom and I look Black, right? And my brother looks Black. So, I mean, it was never like a question for us. But I think if it wasn't for the fact that my father had dealt with his own issues with like microaggressions and anti-Blackness, that he wouldn't have been so prominent in terms of like putting it on my brother and I's mind.
Got it. Wow. I think that really explains it very well. I'm also curious about what inspired you, or what got you to UC Berkeley, and for our listeners who might not know, even though UC Berkeley is a hotbed of diversity and a lot of racial groups, I think the Black population in UC Berkeley is only 1.9 or 2%. And it's been consistently decreasing. I guess it was 1.8 in 2017, 1.9 or 2 in 2018. And since then, it has again reduced to 1.9 or 1.8 again. So I'm curious, what got you to UC Berkeley? What got you to study law? And what are your plans for the future?
Yeah, before I get into that, I also want to build off of what you just said. Not only is the Black population extremely tiny at Cal, which has a population of over 40,000 students, but it has also been deemed the worst public university for Black students.
And why is that?
Based on a USC report, they did a metric report on the different variables that go into an institution to make it more inclusive for their Black students. And a lot of it had to do with the lack of resources, the overall population of Black students at Cal, and just a lot of like the permeation of a lot of anti-Blackness. So there's a lot of variables that go into it. But and I can definitely send you the article later that maybe you can send out on your own.
Yeah, I will just link it in the podcast description for others to read about. Yeah,
no, definitely. It's a very insightful article that I implore a lot of people to check out. But to answer your question though, so my academic journey was definitely unorthodox. I'm actually a community college transfer student. So as I've mentioned earlier, I took great pride in my academics, my education. And in high school, it was a big culture shock for me because I didn't feel very well supported. I felt very ostracized at times, and I felt like I was kind of, pursuing my academic endeavors on my own. And it wasn't just me, it was a lot of fellow Black students that went to my high school, to the point actually where my senior year, a lot of the Black parents were protesting against the administration about the lack of support for their Black, the Black students and their children. And I was kind of viewed as like a leader in that discussion because I was a sharpened academic student, but I also dealt with my fair share of academic struggles because of the lack of support. So with that being said, that's what led me to go to community college. I felt like I had been cheated, I felt like I had put in all that work for nothing for me to just go to community college. Because counselors told me that community college was a place where people don't succeed. It had been highly stigmatized throughout my high school experience. So I just figured once I got to community college, that was a very big low point for me. But then once I got there, my whole perception changed.
Why? What happened?
Yeah, I had support. I had support. It was the first time in my life that I had academic support where people actually
Wow.
wanted to know my ambitions, my endeavors, what I wanted to reach for. And not only did they listen, but then they gave me the tools to obtain those goals. I did a seminar for young black men fresh out of high school the summer before I started my first semester at community college. And it was amazing. They literally gave me all the resources, skills, tools I needed to succeed in college. They taught me how to study. They taught me what resources I can go and access to benefit my academic endeavors. They told me about scholarships, grants, like all of these things that I had never been shared or told about when I was in high school. And that's because we had no black people in leadership in my high school, or people of color for that matter. So, it was very eye opening for me, because I realized then that resources do matter. They do matter. It's not just if you work hard enough you'll succeed. It's more than just working hard. It's also having accessibility and having access to resources, because those resources are what help us catch up to the rest of the people who can just work hard because they identify with a system that benefits them.
They take for granted the resources that are offered to them on a platter. And I guess growing up in India and going to one of the best boarding schools in India also, it was an all boys residential school, but it was one of the most, I would say, privileged schools in the country. And looking back at my time in school, I was just fortunate to have access to resources, which knowing from you that there are situations in which you might not even have access to those resources, and that's when you get to know the value of someone providing those resources to you. I guess that is a big learning for anyone of like a different background, who comes from a background which is not necessarily ostracized or oppressed or dominated over the years.
Exactly. And even people sometimes within the black community don't even see that. They don't understand that even they're directly affected, because they buy into the rhetoric that if I just work hard enough, I can pull myself up by the bootstraps. But research, aggregated data has shown that that's not the case. People need resources. People want to talk about equality, but we need more than just equality. We need equity. And equity, when I say equity, I mean an equal playing field in terms of having the same access to resources and funding that can help us catch up to our contemporaries who are allotted a lot of great amount of privilege and resources already, just for the sake of that they were
Yeah.
born, in the right community.
Absolutely. I totally vibe with that. And that is something, and that is an idea that I've been grappling with, and I've started coming to terms with, especially after the class that I took at Berkeley. And for those who may not know, Jacob, why don't you actually give a description of the class because of which we met, Facing You, Facing Me?
Yeah, so the class is it was held it was held for this nonprofit called Styles Hall. Styles Hall, once again, is a nonprofit that helps get underrepresented students into Cal, and also which consists of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and formerly incarcerated folks, student parents. It's an inclusive space on campus, and it has amazing connections in terms of resources and funding. And the executive director of Styles Hall, Dave Stark, he facilitated this class called Facing You, Facing Me, which he started in the 90s. And essentially it was just to allow students at Cal to have a wake-up call, because Cal is such a big space. And as Avi and I have talked about before, a lot of people tend to just stay to their respective communities, cliques, and don't have really the space to talk about people who don't have the same lifestyles, interests, or experiences as them. So this class was essentially like a roundtable discussion every week to finally talk about and unpack our different life experiences through class, racism, and other inequities.
Yeah, and I can definitely vouch and say that as someone who is studying computer science at UC Berkeley, which is one of the premier colleges for graduating in CS and like just getting that head start in your professional career, I would say that most of my friends, which just happens to be the case, are from backgrounds who only specialize in tech, are predominantly from one or two ethnic backgrounds, even racial backgrounds, And this class was essentially like the apex or the pinnacle of having a full Berkeley experience because it taught me that, well, in reality, things might seem to be one way, but in actuality, they are quite the opposite. There is this entire systemic oppression, or the entire system at times is stacked against people of certain color. And having knowledge about that and getting to learn about people's experiences from that first hand experience is something that is of an invaluable degree. Like it just teaches you so much about life. And that's how I met Jacob. And that's why the class has literally got me so informed and inspired that, both of us and all of us, I'm sure, who are in the class have done our bit and are trying to do our own bits to sort of just fight this systemic oppression and racism.
And yeah, to build off of that, I think for a lot of the folks who don't normally have to worry about race or inequities, this was a wake-up call for them to be more empowered to get involved, because there were a lot of folks in the class who, for us, this wasn't new. We've been fighting for our entire life in terms of against systemic oppression and racism. But I'm thankful that the class was able to give us a platform to talk to other folks who do have more privileged circumstances in society and can become, reliable allies.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember Sierra and Danielle had taken me, Neill, and I guess it was Joseph for this church in Berkeley, and it's called The Way, and it was a predominantly black church, and just being in that environment was one of the first experiences that I've ever had of like being in a predominantly black church and just being part of that community and experiencing the things that are talked about in the church. I remember the pastor talking about how Trump has recently passed an anti-immigration bill, how his policies are unfair, how the specific policies or data about incarceration of black people in Oakland presents a grim picture. Just having knowledge of that and getting to know about that from someone who deals with that on a day-to-day basis was just enlightening. And that's why I'm so grateful and just keep on going on and on about this class.
No, the class was, if you are a Berkeley student listening to this, I highly implore you to visit Stiles Hall and talk to Dave Stark about the class. It's an amazing.
Yes, I will link the details in the description also, so you can feel free to just read up about it and just reach out if there's anything that you'd like to share or be part of the movement. So yeah, I guess Jacob, first of all, thank you so much again. Starting off and having a clear set of questions that I've prepared because I wanted to put in a good amount of thought into this conversation. I'll start with the idea of perfectionism. And I recently watched this video by Ali Abdal, who is someone of productivity kind of a guru who I follow. And he said that the reason he was afraid to talk about these ideas about racism was because he always thought that he needs to know everything and he needs to be an expert about racism, of racism, to be able to talk about it. And he said that in life, there are many things that we just talk about without being an expert on them. Like he does not think of himself as a productivity guru, but at the same time, he talks about productivity. And so I'm wondering and I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the idea of perfectionism preventing people from acting only in the case of racism and structural oppression, but not in other topics? Like, why is that the case? Because I can, and sorry to interrupt, but I can also say for myself that I also felt that I have to fully gain this knowledge and I have to do like an in-depth research and be fully knowledgeable about everything to be able to have this conversation with you or to be able to write that article that I did about, what I've learned from the class and the recent events. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, thank you for providing that context. That's a very, that's actually a topic we've been talking about a lot. And with this movement, we're seeing in this phase in the movement, because the movement's been going on, but in this phase of the movement, we've been witnessing a lot of people calling out the silence from allies and our non-black and white allies. And, I've been seeing rhetoric such as, white silence is violence, things of that nature. And to build off of that point, I think the reasoning why people are quiet is, and in terms of like perfectionism, is because I think they're scared of coming across as ignorant. And I think that's also due to the concept of color blindness, right? Where people will come up to you and say, I don't see color. I love people for everyone for who they are. Martin Luther King once said, don't judge a person by their character and not the content of their skin. But we all know that's a fallacy, right? We can't live in a world that is structured on race and not talk about race and racism. But because people have been entrenched with this and indoctrinated with this rhetoric of, colorblindness and seeing everyone equally, well, they're scared to talk about race because now I think we've been kind of like, I wouldn't say programmed, but I think we've been kind of manipulated in a way to think that talking about race can still be perceived as racism or problematic. But I would tell people who are scared to talk about race that if talking about it is not problematic, it needs to be done. We need to stop acting like talking about race is a sensitive topic. It may be only a sensitive topic for you if you're white, but if you're a person of color, especially, or black or indigenous, we have to talk about it because it's literally our life. We deal with racism on a daily basis. And you can't come up to me and say, well, I'm a black person and I don't deal with race. No, you still do, because trust me, even though people aren't explicitly throwing out racial epithets at you, they're thinking these things. People do have implicit biases. Like I started the discussion telling you about the microaggressions I dealt with. A lot of people don't realize that that's racism. So I think people are so scared to talk about race because they think when they talk about race, it's talking about the civil rights movement and the KKK and, white supremacist groups and Donald Trump's and his racist rhetoric, like things that no, it doesn't have to be, first of all, ultra political. It doesn't have to be talking about moments in history. Now, those things need to be in the discussion. Don't get me wrong. Do not omit those things from the discussion. But that doesn't have to be, the main points of the discussion, right? You can talk about race in a very educational, inclusive manner where we're actually discussing problematic aspects of our society that do uphold, white privilege, white supremacy, and racism. I think with perfectionism, people do want to come across as an expert because I think anytime we do talk about, race, a lot of people were quick to say, hey, that's very ignorant for you to say, oh, you don't know any better. And for the folks who may not know better, acknowledge that. Like, I'm not an expert about race either. And I'm, as a black person, I'm far from knowledgeable about all the different aspects of, race dynamics in our country and society as a whole. But because I am black and I have been directly affected by racism, I feel more empowered to do my homework, to have these discussions in the classroom, in private with family members, and whatnot. I think also people need to understand that racism and talking about race isn't political. Politics are a part of it, but it doesn't have to be a political discussion per se. Because, I think they always say people need to stray away from talking about politics, religion, and I think sexual orientation, which I disagree with. I think we need to talk about that now. But I think, race isn't a hot topic, I think that's why people are scared and are choosing to be silent because they view it as a hot topic. They think, oh no, they're not going to like me. But that's not the case when you're advocating for, human rights. And this is a humanitarian crisis we're dealing with. If you have any form of empathy, I would think you're thinking about this at least. I know it's at least on your mind, and I think you're at least thinking it's wrong. You can even echo that you feel that this is wrong. I mean, I don't really want to give a platform to Elon Musk, but he did tweet the other day about talking about how the war on drugs and how marijuana went from being viewed as a felony charge to an essential business, and yet there's still tons of people who are still locked up for marijuana possession. This isn't right. That's not a hot topic. That's literally facts. That's literally talking about injustice. I think talking about injustice shouldn't be viewed as a hot topic. But that's where I think our K through 12 education comes into play, at least in America, because we haven't taught, hey, don't talk about that. Teachers will try to stray away from that. You know, a lot of people beat around the bush when it comes to race, unless it's the Holocaust, really. A lot of people are scared to talk about, the different injustices, especially American injustices, because, I understand patriotism, I understand nationalism, having pride, in being American. Like, don't get me wrong, I am very thankful that I'm an American and I love being an American. But I think when you love something, you can't be afraid to criticize it and push it to be better. It's like if you see a problematic tendency in a close loved one of yours, you're not going to continue to let that tendency, proliferate and get worse and worse. You're going to address it and have that heart-to-heart conversation. It may be uncomfortable, but you need to have it in order for them to grow. And you wouldn't even engage in that conversation if you didn't love them. So I think with that being said, Avi, I think people are just, they have all of these, tendencies and ideologies in their head, thinking if I talk about race, I'm getting into very, controversial waters. I'm getting into very, polarizing, discussions. But we need to realize that race isn't polarizing, and it's not, a hot topic. It's actually quite normal because, like I said, we live in a world that is based on race.
Got it. I think that is very well explained. The key points that I'm sort of taking away from that is that we need to normalize talking about race and systemic things and injustices, just like how we've normalized talking about, I don't know, like the weather. And it's not only for drawing room conversation, don't get me wrong over there, but at the same time, just not talking about race because of the fear that it might upset someone or it's a hot topic and, it can get controversial, is not a reason to not talk about it. At the same time, you have to talk about it even more, because only by talking about it and sort of having these, even uncomfortable conversations with others, will we normalize talking about race at some level. And once we normalize talking about race and how these things exist in the world, will we be able to just make a difference, just like how we have for other things? Is that the correct takeaway from what you've said?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at. You have, I'm pretty sure a lot of us have heard that expression, you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think it's just ironic because we talk about that in terms of pushing ourselves for growth. And I think we normally talk about professional growth when we say that. And, talking about progressing in life in terms of like our status and stature and whatnot. But in terms of like, I think intellectually growing, we also have to be okay with being uncomfortable. And I think, since we're Berkeley students, Berkeley has pushed us to be very uncomfortable or get very comfortable being uncomfortable in terms of like the different theories, ideologies, and concepts we do learn in the classroom and in our club and group and org discussions. So I would implore a lot of folks who are scared to talk about race to be comfortable with being uncomfortable on the matter, because no one's perfect in this conversation. But until we start talking about it, we're not going to grow and we're not going to learn from it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer again. Going off of that, I'd like to talk about tone policing. And tone policing is a concept that, again, is talked about in the book Me and White Supremacy, and something that I learned about from multiple posts from multiple people on Twitter and from even a few of my friends. And this is something that I literally learned like last week. And the idea of tone policing is that it should not be the case that the content matters less than the tone. And so whenever someone tells you, if you're discussing like an emotional topic, that, hey, you're getting too aggressive, you need to calm down, or, deflecting the content under the guise of the tone is essentially tone policing. And earlier, I would say that I was always of the opinion that let us keep emotions out of the picture, not to say that you shouldn't empathize with the other person, but to say that emotions only cloud the decision that you have to take in the moment, or how you have to act. But now, having learned about tone policing, I've realized that actually it's totally okay for emotions to come into the picture, because someone who has gone through that experience will necessarily bring that up. And I was wondering, what thoughts do you have on tone policing, and how could we, because you talked about microaggressions, how could we reduce or completely eliminate the idea of tone policing?
Yeah, no, thank you for wanting to talk about tone policing, because that's definitely something we face constantly in the Black community in terms of trying to educate folks, specifically non-Black folks. So tone policing, you got the definition correct. It's when one tries to dismiss your whole point and argument simply because of the tone you're speaking in, which is very ignorant. It's very ignorant. That in and of itself is a microaggression. It once again is trying to uphold whiteness, because in the realm of whiteness, theoretically speaking, white people don't talk that way, right? They don't talk with sheer passion, where we're like screaming, crying, very emotional. Emotions in our community are very prevalent, and it's okay to embody our emotions. When you feel something, you need to express it fully. That's how emotions work. We're not robots. So when we're talking about subjects that directly impact our lives, our loved ones have been affected, such as police brutality, you can't dismiss what I'm trying to convey to you simply because I'm talking with passion, because this stuff is I'm passionate in this stuff because it's my life we're talking about here. So in terms of like trying to fix this matter, it's going to take a lot of open-mindedness, first of all. I think one takeaway I've learned, especially after my academic journey, was the ideal of take space, make space, right? Where if you're going to assert your points, then you got to make space for others in the room to make their points as well. And with that being said, when you tone police, you're not making space. You are once again taking space, because no one was correcting you, no one was correcting you when you were talking or giving your points, but because you said it in a calm manner, it wasn't problematic. But then when a person, is literally yelling out how they feel and their emotions, but everything they're saying makes valid sense and is rooted in text and evidence and whatnot, by you saying, hey, watch your tone, that completely negates everything they just talked about, which once again doesn't make any space for them. So I think people need to also understand how to make space for folks. Inclusivity is really important, Avi. It's very important. People need to understand that being inclusive is being understanding regardless of where someone is coming from. And then being receptive to what that person is telling you in return. I understand people who are very, supportive of, police currently, don't quite understand why, the Black community feels attacked. We'll probably be quick to try to go to tone policing, or we'll be quick to, criticize what we're trying to explain to them. But I would, once again, highly recommend to them and nudge them to just sit and listen for once. Don't listen with the intent to reply. Listen with the intent to understand. I think this just comes with emotional maturity. And I think we need to do a better job as a society on teaching people how to be emotionally mature and emotionally intelligent. Because we're not, a lot of us, especially, I know like in the Black community, me being a Black male, we're not taught to be emotionally intelligent. We're kind of taught that, within our own community, we are entitled to a lot of stuff. We just have to continuously work. What we have to say doesn't really matter so much. So anytime we do want to talk about things that emotionally bother us, people are quick to discount us, and then vice versa, we're quick to discount other people because we never feel like we're given space. So then I think a lot of us find ourselves asking, why should I give space? So that's just the Black community, but even for other communities, that's the same problem. I think a lot of us just aren't taught emotional intelligence, which is damaging and very abhorrent and egregious to what we're trying to accomplish here. And that's for people to understand how long systemic racism has existed and how it continues to attack and terrorize us today.
Yeah, I guess that really sums it up well. I would also go on to say that when you talk about emotional intelligence and you make the claim that people in your community aren't taught emotional intelligence, I would clarify and say to everyone who's listening to this is that emotional intelligence, especially on the matter of race, is not the ability to talk about race without emotions. Rather, it's the ability to understand others' emotions when they are talking about race passionately. Because in the general sense, the idea of emotional intelligence is to be able to understand your emotions, process them, and present your points in a very meaningful and empathetic manner. But specifically on the context of race, when someone has gone through something that is not pleasant, the idea of emotional intelligence is not to just disregard emotions and to not bring emotions into the conversation. Rather, if the emotions do come into the conversation, to be able to understand, process them, and reply to them either in an equally emotional manner, or in a manner that understands and allows them to realize that you have understood their point.
That's exactly it. Yeah, just I think just empathy is the driving force in that, and emotional intelligence is empathy, which is different than sympathy. Sympathy is when you feel sorry for someone, but then empathy is when you feel for someone. And I think I would also recommend that people look up the difference and research the difference between those two as well, because I think a lot of times in society we're taught sympathy but never truly taught empathy.
Yeah. I remember I was reading this letter by Martin Luther King Jr. when he was in the Birmingham jail, and he distinguished between what is just and what is legal, and he said that it was completely legal for in Hitler's time to kill the Jews, but it wasn't just. And I guess having that distinction really links well to the distinction between sympathy and empathy, because once we know the subtle differences between things that make huge difference, I think it'll be a great step forward in terms of being able to understand these topics and making progress on them.
Exactly. People need to understand that, like, legality doesn't equal morality.
Exactly, and equality doesn't equal equity. Exactly. I think these are some great thoughts over here that I'd love to sort of write down and just think about more and have this conversation with other people also. Moving on, I'd like to talk about the third thing that I'd like to talk about is this idea of virtue signaling that really aligns well with tone policing and the first thing that we talked about in terms of perfectionism. And I'm curious because when I say record this podcast with you, or when someone who may be a person of color but who hasn't gone through the structural oppression that someone else might have gone through tries to speak up or donate or just do their little acts of being part of the movement, I wonder what the thoughts are that you have on this, because many people consider this to be an act of virtue signaling, which is different from actually being virtuous and doing the right thing. So, does that mean that, if you donate, you should not tell others that you have donated? Or like, I don't know, like subtle things like these, I think really play on people's minds when they're trying to act for something that they haven't directly faced. And I wonder, what are your thoughts on this entire matter?
Yeah, no, I've seen that too. I've seen the discussion of virtue signaling. What I have to say to that, my retort to that would be, is really spreading awareness signaling virtue? I mean, what we're trying to do here is save lives. We're trying to spread awareness on systemic racism, discussions that have never been discussed in dining room tables before is finally being discussed. People who have never had to think about race once a day in their life, people who have taken the stance of ignorance is bliss, are finally becoming more aware. And I think it would just be it's just be doing your due diligence in terms of spreading awareness for donations, petitions, protests going on, organizations. That's not virtue signaling. Now, if you're an individual who isn't consistent, I will say that, then yeah, you might be onto something there. If you just drop one donation and you're not consistent with the other aspects that go into the movement, I mean, I could understand why one may still try to subjugate you to that, but I still would argue that's not the case. There's a lot of people working behind closed doors that we don't even know about. And I know because we live in the social media era, the tendency to fall into that trope can be more prevalent. But once again, I think that's just a scapegoat. I think people are trying to mask the bigger problem here, and that's we're trying to abolish and get rid of
Yeah.
institutionalized racism.
Yeah, and I asked this question because I don't know if you know this tech leader who is the founder of AngelList, Naval Ravikant. What happened was that one of my friends actually tweeted at Naval saying that, here we have a leader who is not concerned or who hasn't posted anything about the recent events in the past few weeks, and despite having 700,000 followers, has continues to post about remote work, email, and other things. And instantly, the very next minute, Naval blocked him, and then he took a screenshot of that and he tweeted that, and that sort of gained a little bit of traction, and that really got me thinking about this idea of virtue signaling and whether, if anyone is posting or if anyone is not posting, does their silence mean that if they only post philosophical thoughts, which Naval does, that is virtue signaling, or if they speak up, on an issue that they haven't spoken up before, that is virtue signaling. And I was just wondering about that, and hence the question. So I'd love to hear if you also have any thoughts on this particular occurrence.
Yeah, that individual I'm now aware of, so thank you for letting me know about that. That's actually something I'll probably look into myself. But that's also been a very hot topic, is people who've been very silent. I think it is very demeaning, because I think this, once again, we're talking about a humanitarian crisis here. This isn't the time to become quote unquote political. This isn't the time to pick a side. Polarism is out the window right now. I think we need to understand that we are trying to fight against white supremacy right now. We're trying to dismantle an entire system, not a group, an entire system that has benefited off of oppressing individuals. And I understand how someone of his stature who has benefited from capitalism would probably not want to criticize, the institution, because it works for him. It works for them, right? And they benefit from it. And just to kind of also build off of that, you're probably aware of the rapper Kendrick Lamar. He's also been very silent on social media about the issues we're witnessing right now. But I think, in defense of him, he has every right to be silent, because he's perpetuated so much music on these issues, and he has helped the cause in so many different ways that people are aware of and not aware of. And I think for him being quiet, it's not like he's damaging the cause. Go listen to his music to educate yourself. I mean, to Pimp a Butterfly, damn, Section 80, like all his albums literally talk about the issues we're witnessing right now and systemic racism. That's literally what he has used as his platform to get to where he is right now. You listen to every song that is famous from Kendrick, it's literally a political, social awareness song. It's not just a casual song. Even Swimming Pools, that was a party song. But if you listen to what he's talking about, I
had listened to that.
Yeah, he's talking about the dangers of alcoholism and whatnot. So, I mean, it's like, I don't think he has... I'm not saying he gets a pass, but we don't know what he's doing behind closed doors. And I don't know Kendrick, obviously, but I would have to think that he is doing his due diligence still behind closed doors. And just because he isn't speaking out on the Black Lives Matter movement currently, I think that would be quite ignorant for one to say he's not supporting the cause, because his music clearly illustrates that he has and will continue to support the cause. So going back to your earlier point, I don't think it's wrong for someone to call out someone who's been active on social media. Because Kendrick hasn't even been active on social media. So, I mean, that's also another thing, too. Maybe he's hardly on social to begin with. If this person's already very active on social media and has a huge platform, but then refuses to use their platform to benefit, humanity, I don't think that's virtue signaling. I think that's just showing that they have something deeper in them that they need to unpack.
Yeah, and I guess questioning that is a good idea, because, as you said, if someone from the system profits from the system, and I'm not in any way laying any allegations or saying anything wrong about him, but just in general, if someone chooses not to engage in such topics because intuitively they feel that they have probably benefited from their privilege, I I guess what I'm understanding from you is that calling them out is probably necessary.
I think, applying pressure. If you look at the civil rights era, every organized protest that was put together lasted months, years.
Yeah.
It wasn't overnight. And I think, especially a lot of one percenters, I think they're hoping that this will just be another trend that blows over. But people need to understand that this isn't a trend. This is something we need to continuously apply pressure on, because they want us to just drop it off and say, okay, on to the next thing, and I know, and they're probably also hoping that because we're also simultaneously in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, that this will also be something that loses steam, because we then once again have to pivot back to the public health crisis. But I will argue we are witnessing, racism has always been an epidemic, first of all, but we are witnessing a syndemic where two epidemics are colliding, and we're just going to have to get used to those two things being intermeshed with one another.
What's the word that you used?
Syndemic.
Wow. Okay, that's a new word that I'm just coming across. So I definitely look into that. I guess this was definitely informative. Moving on from sort of virtue signaling, I wanted to talk about structural racism and police brutality in particular. And for structural racism, I know that you have talked a lot about how there are structural things that exist that are not in favor of, minorities and people of color and so on and so forth. And for those who might not know, I'd like to point out a few specific facts that I got from multiple sources that really highlight what the problem is over here. So let's start with wealth. Whites are 77% of the population and they own 90% of the national wealth. African Americans are 13% of the US population and they only own 2.6% of the national wealth. And the Latino families, in contrast, hold only 2.3% of the national wealth. And for every $100 that a white family earns, a black family earns $57.3. That's like in terms of just wealth. In terms of unemployment, African Americans are 2 times more likely to be unemployed than white people. In terms of education, black students are 3 times more likely than white students to be suspended for the same things, for the same quote unquote crimes or infractions than what white students commit. In terms of criminal justice, blacks only form like 13% of the population, but blacks only constitute 13% of the US population, but over 40% of the entire prison population. In terms of housing, we all know that in the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation ranked neighborhoods like all across the country, giving high marks and high credit ratings to all white neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods which had minorities in them considered them to be as risky investments. And then there's the idea of surveillance, that black drivers are 30% more likely to be pulled over than their counterparts. And in terms of healthcare, 67% of doctors have a bias against African American patients. And this bias is totally unconscious. And in terms of the coronavirus also, we have seen how it is spreading much more rapidly in communities of people of color. And like all of these facts put out, what are your views on how structural racism exists? What can we do to prevent that? And how, at a very subtle level, can that be fixed? And to qualify the third question of the subtlety aspect, I'm asking this because in terms of the employment, I read this research that said that white sounding names are likely to get jobs, the same jobs, than the black sounding names will. And I wonder, what are your thoughts on how to fix this, why this exists, and how can we fix it at a subtle level?
Yeah. And I mean, before I go into my perspective on this, I don't have all the answers, obviously. It's a very multivalent
totally
topic, but I will do my best to at least give you my purview on this. So with that being said, let's start with, how black people even ended up in America, right? Through the transatlantic slave trade, right? 400 plus years ago. when the first slaves were brought to Jamestown, Virginia, and, were set on the coast. We think about how race was then developed through this system. I mean, look at Bacon's Rebellion. For those of y'all who aren't aware of what Bacon's Rebellion is, it's when white indentured servants, along with black indentured servants, because black people were indentured servants as well before they became straight up chattel slaves, essentially challenged the status quo. They challenged the white folks in power, and they almost succeeded. They almost didn't succeed. It was actually a very successful revolt, but eventually they didn't win. Bacon's team lost, and Bacon was murdered. But after that, that's when America at least realized we can't continue this system. We can't allow black people and white people to team up like this again. So then slave owners started talking to the white indentured servants and said, hey, I'll give you a chunk of my land if you come and work for me as an overseer. You'll get a little chunk of land, and you can work for me while you maintain my slaves, and then this piece of land will be yours forever. And for people who don't understand this, land, it means power. John Locke illustrated that in his 2 treatises of government, talking about how property was an essential factor in terms of power and being and maintaining your individualism. So for black people, we were never granted that right, first of all, to have access to land, because we were quickly dehumanized, because white slave owners and white officials in power were quick to give the poor white working class land and advantages from the jump to make sure that there was all an immediate power structure. Because once you make them think, oh, I'm better than you simply because the color of my skin, I have no reason to fight for you now. I have no reason to fight with you. So they think and then for the powerful white people, it gave them a compromise, because now they think they got the poor white people thinking, oh, I got land now. I'm finally validated. When in actuality, we realized that no, you got a very, very, very tiny piece of the pie, and they took the whole rest of the pie. So
yeah,
but a lot of people don't understand that. And if you talk about like Spanish colonialism in Latin America, they set up a entire caste system with like 60 plus different pigmentations of color. And of course, white was at the very top and black was at the very bottom. So, if we think about just like the sociology of where and the psychology of where, race comes from and how it is socially constructed, that leads us into the society we are today, where once again, white supremacy still holds true, and black and brown folks are very much, marginalized and disenfranchised, and in many ways, spread apart. And I'm not trying to get into a whole history lesson, but then we also have to, after slavery was finally abolished, which took 250 years to finally get to that point, then we had Jim Crow. We had the Reconstruction era, which only lasted a cute 10 years, and then we call this like the white backlash, if you will, where Southern whites said, oh no, that's not fair, we can't start giving black folks rights. So then judges and legal officials and whatnot started interpreting the law to benefit white folks, and that's where the one drop rule came into play. That's where all these poll taxes, all these different ways to disenfranchise the black vote came into play. That's when convict leasing came into play. Just all of these different, tactics and strategies to disenfranchise and mitigate black people as citizens. And Jim Crow lasted 100 years, 100 years of that, where you couldn't be in the same room as a white person. You were not viewed as equal. You didn't have a say. You didn't have a seat at the table. And that's just how life was. You were constantly lynched due to rape allegations from white women. And Ida B. Wells specifically talks about this in her book, Anti-Lynching. So it's all these different variables, right, from a historical standpoint that, that's extremely damaging and puts black people way behind. So at this point, we're already, 400 years, we're already 300 years behind. And then now we are in this new era where, some people have called it the new Jim Crow era. I mean, Michelle Alexander didn't write the new Jim Crow for no reason. We are in a new generation where mass incarceration has become the new gatekeeper for maintaining white supremacy. And I know this is going to trigger a lot of people, but mass incarceration ties exactly with the police. And that's why police brutality is an issue. That's why the prison industrial complex is an issue. And that's why the way prisons and police as a system are problematic, because they were always meant to uphold whiteness and white supremacy. And I mean, this isn't, I mean, I'm not making this up. I mean, I know people want to say like that's just liberal, jargon, but it's literally not. Evidence has proved otherwise. It's documented, it's on paper. So in terms of, trying to solve what we're witnessing today, I mean, you'll get the whole spectrum. You'll get people saying reform, which I don't think will work, but I think it can be used as at least a medium for now to try to cave a little way. But I mean, this is going to sound really radical, but we have to completely get rid of the whole system and build it back up. Because let's face it, it was a bunch of rich white men who drafted the Constitution back in the 1700s. At the constitutional conventions, they did not have black people in mind whatsoever. They didn't have women in mind whatsoever. So I mean, it was never meant to necessarily see everyone as equal. And I would like to think this is common sense, but I understand now, especially in light of everything I've been seeing, from people who oppose, the Black Lives Matter movement, that it's not that obvious. When John Locke wrote all men were created equal, and then Thomas Jefferson stole that from him, they weren't talking about black people. They literally they said all rich white men were created equal, right? So that's why we're seeing a lot of systemic and structural racism now, because it was never meant to uphold us as equal. It was never meant to view us as equal. If they genuinely viewed us as equal, we wouldn't see underfunded schools. We wouldn't see high density rates in poor communities. We wouldn't see destitution. We wouldn't see higher incarceration rates of black people. We wouldn't see higher suspension rates. We wouldn't see all of these different variables if we were indeed viewed as equal. But because we live in a white supremacy nation, or a nation that upholds white supremacy, people are quick to buy into that rhetoric that, people just need to do better. People need to stop committing crime. People need to just pull themselves up by the bootstraps, because that's what they want you to think. They want you to think it's them, not us, as a society and as a system.
Yeah.
I think that really says a lot in terms of why this systemic racism or oppression specifically against the black community exists. Well, the United States was simply not founded on the basis of having access and providing resources for communities or people of color. As you said, it was essentially a bunch of white men who drafted the Constitution who didn't have people of color in mind. And therefore, the claim that a system that upholds the existing status quo, which is inherently biased against the black community, needs reform at a foundational, fundamental level, which means that it needs to be torn apart and it needs to be, built up from the ground. But what does that really mean when you say, it sounds super great to be able to listen to that in terms of, why there should be equality of opportunity for everyone. But in terms of like a real actionable thing, what does that look like? What does that world look like? And how can we sort of fix this structural racism at subtle levels of microaggression, or of choosing a candidate whose name sounds just like a white person's name, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, and that's a very hard question to answer, simply because we're so entrenched in the system that change is slow. If it takes 3 weeks to develop a good habit, but only 5 to 7 days to break it, we've been in this habit for so long. It's gonna be really hard to break it, because it's a bad habit we're in. It's harder to break a bad habit than it is to break a good habit. So, I think in terms of I'm trying to speak from the Black radical tradition when I say this. Reform doesn't work. It never has. It never really will. Because if that was the case, the civil rights movement would have solved everything. And here we are 60 years later, and it hasn't solved anything, right? So I think with that being said, we can't just do political reform. But how do we accomplish that? That is the biggest conundrum that a lot of us, whether we're scholars, activists, teachers, whatever it may be. We're still trying to juggle that because everyone has their own perspective on that. If you ask for mine, as a political science major, I will say we should be voting in more people of color, more Black, indigenous, POC representatives. And it really starts from localism. I think everyone wants to get caught up in the president elections, which, don't get me wrong, the president is because they are the face of the nation, is a very important election, and we still need to make sure we're getting the right people there. But let's face it, the people who even have a shot at the presidency are people who started at the local level and worked their way up and snaked their way up all the way up to be in a position where they could become the president. So if we want people that are genuinely for us and for the cause, we need to start at the local level. And that starts with getting your assembly members in office, your House of Representatives, your senators, your board members, things of that nature, people who are genuinely for the cause, like AOC, Alexandria, Cortez, like, she is a great example of someone that is literally from her community, doesn't come from a whole lot, and gets it, and she's viewed as a crazy liberal because of that. But guess what? There's many people like her across the nation, and obviously in really hot pockets where they don't think like this, they like, especially like specifically like poor working class white communities, they don't have representatives from those communities who probably will be for us. But let's face it, in terms of like most of the bigger hotspots in this nation, in terms of density and whatnot, there's representatives in those pockets that truly get it. And that's also why, on the contrary, people will say that's not going to work, because we're still going to have a lot of, people who are going to get elected, and due to their white privilege, are going to be able to snake up way faster than, Black, indigenous, POC representatives who want to actually represent the cause. The reason why Obama was able to snake all the way up was because he's really good at respectability politics. And don't get me wrong, I like Obama, but respectability politics isn't going to cut it. But with that being said, Obama...
What is respectability politics?
Yeah, respectability politics is essentially when you don't want to address, systemic racism to the point where we're trying to like abolish it, you're basically trying to like tread waters lightly. You're trying to maintain a middle ground. That's the best way I can put it. You're trying to maintain a middle ground. Like, the conversation we're having right now would make some people very uncomfortable, and that's because they want to maintain respectability between one another. It's like being considered well liked by your peers, right? Hence respectability. But we can't compromise our morals. I feel like if we truly, genuinely are passionate about this work, we can't compromise our morals to maintain respectability when this is literally a crisis we're enduring and have been enduring. That's why we've been screaming enough is enough. So once again, like I said, the valence of this issue is very dense and complex, and there's a lot of intricacies that play along with it. But it definitely starts from the bottom up, and we need to do our best to continue applying pressure on our current elected officials, get people in these seats that will at least stimulate some change. Look at Elijah Cunningham, right? He rest in peace. He passed away this past year, but he was an individual who could resonate precisely with, the Black struggle as a civil rights activist himself. And, this is putting a lot of burden on us. That's why he passed away in his 60s, because of all the stress and, the immense pressure he had to fight being, a Black elected official. So essentially, it's like we need more people like him and other people that are Black, indigenous, and POC that get it in office, because it's too much stress and burden on the folks who are the minority there. We saw Trump criticize literally 4 representatives, women of color, and was telling them to go back home. Come on now. We can't. That's the type of issue. And it's because they're a minority, he can say that. If they were the majority, he wouldn't say that. So we need to get more people like that, and because they get it. But like I said, I know I've been using that word a lot, but that's just the true case of the matter, is that we need to get people who genuinely understand and can resonate heavily with the current struggle we're witnessing.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, I guess, fixing this structural racism, the first step is to understand that it is so complex and it has such a long history that it requires some time, effort, and a dedicated, concerted effort to fix this, because it started off, with the independence of the US, and even before that, with slavery and all those other things that have cumulatively had an impact on why this structural form of racism exists today. And at a second level, if you do really want to fix it, I know I cannot vote right now because I'm an international student. But for those who can, beginning to vote at a local level is probably one of the first steps that you can take to trying to fix this, systemic oppression. And I know that it's easier said than done, and it's easy to say that, hey, I'm going to vote. But when it comes to actually, standing in the lines and, taking a day off and actually just voting, like the voter turnout that actually ends up happening for young people is pretty low. I don't have the exact numbers, but that is what usually happens. I'm not sure if it happened this year or last year or in 2018 when the midterm elections were happening, but I do know that over the past few years that has been the pattern. So I guess that really needs to change if we want to bring about a meaningful change in this structural racism.
Yeah, and to kind of add on to that, I think what we're seeing right now with Biden being the Democratic ticket, a lot of Black people are, disinterested in the Democratic Party, because once again, and that's why being in a bipartisan nation also isn't going to solve, racism and the issues that Black people, are constantly dealing with. We do need a Black agenda, and unfortunately, old white men aren't going to cut it. And people who are being, planned and strategically placed to be at the forefront of these parties aren't going to cut it either. So that's why I also want to put emphasis on localism, because it's going to get to a point where they have no choice but to put people who want to support, our cause, whether it's like Stacey Abrams, Dr. Shirley Weber, who, if y'all don't know, she's a assembly member for California that has just put up the Assembly Bill ACA 5, which will repeal Prop 209. And Prop 209 was a proposition passed, I believe, in 1996. Don't quote me, either 1996 or 1999, where it repealed and got rid of affirmative action in all California schools. UC Berkeley literally went from being 12% Black to 2% in 30 years. And that is far from progress. How is it that 30 years in the future, we're 10% less? And that's simply because we have gotten rid of a resource that is needed in the Black community. That's not a handout. That's a resource. That's what I mean when I say equity. That is literally equity. That's how you gain equality.
I guess that really makes sense. Going on, we talked a lot about, or we talked a little bit about police brutality in terms of the structural racism, and you had mentioned that. And before this call, and when I wrote that article, Michael from the same class actually told me that while I do agree with most of what you say in the article, I don't agree with the fact that there are some police officers who are bad and then there are others who are good. So his claim was that the police system exists to structurally oppress the minorities. And in terms of the qualified immunity that is guaranteed to police officers and the notion of police brutality that is being talked a lot about the entire nation, across the entire nation, I was wondering, what are your thoughts on these two concepts, and how does that feed into structural racism?
Yeah, no, I mean that's definitely I think the crux of this conversation is how the police, are like essentially they're the gatekeepers of the system we're in right now. They are the ones locking up, Black and brown people at a much more disproportionate rate, right, than white people and non-Black folks. It's I mean, a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of corporations, fund these prisons and the prison industrial complex. If y'all haven't watched 13th, please watch that, because it literally shows you why prisons are a business in and of themselves. They're not just keeping, quote unquote, the streets safe. They're literally a business, and you need prisoners to fund that business. So police are taught to genuinely arrest people at any chance they can, because they're trying to fund these private prisons. And if we talk about the inception of policing, when it was first instituted, in the North, in Boston, it was just to protect property, protect commodities from white business owners. And in the South, well, guess what the main commodity was? It was slaves. So anytime a slave would run away or was stolen and whatnot, slave patrol, they called them slave patrol, but they were also called like what we would consider police, were instituted to make sure that their commodity didn't get away. People need to remember that slaves were not viewed as people, they were viewed as property. And with that being said, how can you tell me that the police are for black people when they were instituted to view us as an item that had to be detained and brought back to their plantation? So I just, and the whole rhetoric behind a good cop is highly problematic simply because they're turning a blind eye to the issue. A good cop may not brutalize someone, or may not, profile someone, but guess what? They definitely have someone in their precinct, a colleague, a partner who does, perform those racial activities and do discriminate and propagate white supremacy. But guess what? They don't say anything because they're taught to uphold their partner and have their back, because that's what the system demands. You can't just go against your colleague, and that once again is entrenched in the whole ideology of white supremacy. There was another point I was going to say, but I kind of lost my train of thought here. But it's like, I mean, it's similar to, like, if you see someone like being very abusive, if you have a close friend that's being very abusive to maybe someone close to them, but you don't say anything because you don't want to hurt your friend or make your friend look bad. I mean, I know that could be kind of a porous analogy, but I think the overall principle remains true. You're turning a blind eye to something that's clearly an issue. And because you're not saying anything, that's why silence contributes to the oppression, because you're not saying anything. So if people want to know what a good cop genuinely looks like, that's someone who tells himself, I do not want to contribute to the system no longer, and therefore I will resign. That is what a good cop genuinely would do. But most people don't see it that way, unfortunately, because they just don't understand the different layers that go into systemic racism and the history behind that.
Wow, that is very well put, and thank you so much for explaining all of that. Just sort of going off of that, do you think, or what are your views, because I don't want to ask you a leading question, what are your views on qualified immunity being offered to police officers?
And just to distill that a little bit, when you say qualified immunity, essentially if they kill someone and they're not locked up for life?
I guess that is one meaning of it. But if there is any other meaning, please feel free to share that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a double standard, right? If a cop kills someone, they're essentially they're going to be given the doubt to the farthest extent, and then when people finally realize, okay, yeah, they did kill them, probably they didn't lawfully kill them, then they try to give them the lightest sentence possible. If we look in the case of Oscar Grant, who was shot in the back twice by a BART policeman, he got involuntary manslaughter, and he only had to serve 2 months of his 18-month-long sentence. That right there is what I would consider qualified immunity. I mean, if he wasn't a police officer, that wouldn't be the case. Anyone else, you and I both know this, anyone else who would have done the same thing would have been locked up, at least for second-degree murder. At least second degree, and possibly even first degree. Especially if they were black. Don't let them be black, So we have to also acknowledge that there are double standards. Just because they're trained to quote-unquote detain people, a cop doesn't have to resort to pulling out their gun on an unarmed individual who's pinned on the ground. I think people always miss that. They always miss the logic behind that. Like, how is it logical for someone to pull out their gun and shoot someone in the back twice? And I know they made in the case of Oscar Grant, this officer made the excuse or the alibi that, well, I thought I pulled on my taser. Officers know the difference between a taser and a gun. They're literally trained. They're trained. These are trained professionals. And when a doctor accidentally kills someone, they're held liable because they're trained to perform surgeries and to prioritize the health of their patients. So I just think the same measures need to be applied to police officers if we are going to, hold them accountable as well. And that's why people have been expressing defunding, demilitarizing, and altogether abolishing the police, because it is overall a problematic system that has done more damage than good to society as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. I guess moving on from that, I follow this YouTuber MKBHD, and he had this. He said this, and it really struck me. He said that he does not want to be called or labeled a black tech YouTuber. He just wants to be called a YouTuber. And I guess that was a really, really powerful statement because it just, as you said previously, it centers on the idea of white centering. That if we see a white male or someone who's from the majority race, we don't classify them as a white male. But when we go to a predominantly black society, I mean, this statement itself, what I'm saying is flawed. We say that, oh, he is a black person, or they belong to the black community. And I wonder, how can that level of a subtle form of racism, I wouldn't say that it is racism, but I would say that it's a sort of, I actually don't know what to call that, but how could that notion or idea be fixed?
Yeah, I mean, to put a label on that, that's internalized self-hatred. And that's inherently anti-black to not address your blackness. I think that's problematic personally. I don't think one should, once again, especially if you're black, dismiss race, because people are, even if that's cute that people will call you, like you want to be called a YouTuber, but unfortunately people aren't going to call you a YouTuber. They're still going to address you as such, a black YouTuber, because that's your identity. And unfortunately, you're right. A white person won't get the same treatment because, once again, the system benefits them. They are the system, right? So people aren't going to call out someone who's a part of who's completely benefiting from the system. I think, I mean, I think the best way to solve this is people need to be taught on what anti-blackness is, and how anti-blackness is damaging to the cause, because anti-blackness it's associated with racism, but it is also a separate dichotomy as well. I'm not no expert on anti-blackness, but it is one of those situations where if you can't acknowledge, blackness, or someone being black, or someone's identity is black, that's anti-black. If you want to, assimilate to whiteness, that's anti-black. We have to maintain our roots, because we already maintain, a white person's roots in terms of the entire system. And that can be very polarizing, I understand, but that's just also a fact of the matter as well, is that a lot of, black leaders and whatnot, I think have been kind of like, disempowered in terms of their blackness, and totally embracing that. And I can't blame them per se. Society, constantly tries to make us feel like we're not unique. But we have to understand that being black is powerful. It's not a diatribe. It's not derogatory. It's not a negative, identity label. That's who we are. It's beautiful. I think people need to feel empowered in that regard as well.
So, would you disagree that calling someone a black YouTuber, or saying that this is a predominantly black community, does not mean that the entire notion of labeling people is white-centric? Or would you say that it's okay to call someone black, and specifically add the adjective of black before their occupation or whatever it is that they're doing?
Yeah, I think, some would argue we shouldn't put emphasis on being black, because that might come across as polarizing or problematic, or, derogatory. But the only reason why it might come across as derogatory is because we've always been taught that black is negative. As a society, we've always viewed black, black is a very dark color, right? I think we've always been, taught that being black is not a good thing. It's not a bright experience. But I'm here today to tell people that no, being black is amazing. It's beautiful. We have to, take back the word and apply it with our definition. As black people, we have that right. And not uphold, the definition that has been insinuated by white supremacy, if that makes sense. Because due to the system of whiteness that we live in, it has, put black and blackness in this box of negativity. And that's why when people say, oh, don't say black, people view it as offensive, because that's what literally, the psychoanalysis of whiteness would perpetuate. I just think, that's why I have a problem with the African American label, because I think that once again divides the entire diaspora, from folks who've been taken out of Africa, because at the end of the day, we are all black. Even though we have different experiences and we do come from different ethnicities of blackness, at the end of the day, we're all still black.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that really answers the question well, and at its core, I think it challenges the premise of what it was that I was asking, which is that, when someone says that they don't necessarily want to be called a black tech YouTuber, you're saying that that is in fact a statement of power, because embracing being black is a statement of power, because otherwise, if you don't, then it's like internalized self-hatred, as you said. And I guess I'll have to rewatch that video, because I guess it was in a particular context that he said what he did. But I guess on a general level, this idea of not wanting to be called black or a person of color when you are one, being used as an adjective before your occupation or what it is that you do, not wanting that is a sign of weakness. I guess that is what I'm really understanding from what you're saying. I guess that really makes a lot of sense. Moving on to just sort of like wrapping up and asking questions about the current times, which is the current time section that I have right in front of me. I was wondering, what do you think is the key message that people are trying to share? Because there definitely is a lot of rhetoric, and the message on one level you might say is obvious, and if it's not obvious, then you're dumb. Someone could make that argument, but what exactly is the key message that all these protests are sharing? I guess that's the first question. And the second question is, throughout history, we've had leaders. We've had Gandhi. We've had Martin Luther King Jr. We've had Malcolm X. We've had so many leaders lead different kinds of movements. Who is really the leader today?
You know, I don't think we have a bona fide leader. I think this is the first time where I can confidently say it's a collective effort. And our mission as a collective effort is to dismantle the system of white supremacy in strong correlation with systemic racism. And I mean, yeah, like you said, someone might say that's dumb, but I understand that a lot of people aren't and haven't been knowledgeable about this because they purposely choose to ignore the conversation constantly, whether they're black, white, POC. I think the conversation of race and racism and white supremacy has constantly been dodged. And I think the media has had a lot to do with that, They really do control, I think, the temperature check. They control the pulse, if you will, of what our discussions consist of. And with that, I think it's now time for us to take the initiative ourselves and to make sure we're also controlling the narrative, the rhetoric, and not letting it get too manipulated by what the media wants to perpetuate. And that's why we've also been demanding and asking our allies and even our fellow black people to have those uncomfortable conversations with their loved ones and their friends and their coworkers and colleagues and whatnot, and associates, because if we choose to be silent, we are essentially being complacent and complicit in the system of oppression that we are currently in. And if we continue to be silent, then change won't occur. Closed mouths simply don't get fed. And I think, we need to be able to have these conversations and understand that these conversations are not problematic, but in fact productive. And that we're not being performative when we put out this rhetoric, but we're actually genuinely trying to be, once again, productive and help others. And, one battle at a time, But I think solving systemic racism and dissolving white supremacy will be a really, really great step in terms of addressing all the other humanitarian needs we need to address.
Wow. So I guess that is like the key message that this collective movement is going at, which is great to know. Dismantling the system of white supremacy that exists at every level is the key idea of all the protests. And just sort of going off of that in terms of the current times, I was wondering if you could share what you have done as a black individual for the cause of the message of the protests, and how can people, and I'll obviously link the resources, the places to donate and other stuff in the description, but how can people come together and make a difference in terms of making a difference for the entire movement?
Yeah. Well, I've been doing a lot of like behind the scenes stuff. I've been signing petitions on justice for for the folks who've been murdered in by police brutality, whether from Breonna Taylor to David McAtee, Tony McDade, George Floyd, obviously, and we see with George Floyd, he's starting to finally get his justice by all the officers being arrested, which was due to our petitions and us applying pressure. I've also been giving donations to grassroots efforts such as the Black Lives Matter movement, People's Breakfast Oakland, which is a grassroots initiative in Oakland that's been around for years, mind you. And their whole mission is to essentially fight against systemic racism, whether from helping out the homelessness to fighting against police brutality, bailing out folks who have been actively protesting and are unlawfully incarcerated currently because of what's going on right now. I've been also working on a newsletter with a group of other folks from our Facing Me class. If you could link that, I would also appreciate it.
For sure.
Yeah. So, and we've been just also perpetuating knowledge on there and just giving people more access to knowledge and different resources. In our latest edition, which just came out today, we put out a movie and TV show list of shows and movies that are very socially that spread social justice awareness and explain more about what it means to embrace Blackness and Black empowerment. So we've just been doing a lot of ends like that. During my time at Cal, I was on the board of our Black Recruitment and Retention Center to help address the systemic racism we're dealing with in terms of the low admittance rate and acceptances and overall population of Black students at Cal. So this work, it doesn't stop. This is a lifetime commitment. And these are just some of the endeavors that I'm currently helping out with, but this is just the beginning before I do plan to go to law school and continue helping from that side.
Wow. And what could people who are just listening to this podcast, if they have already donated, have been part of the protests, and do understand that this systemic form of racism does exist, what can they do to go a step beyond to be part of the movement?
Yeah. For one, I would implore you not to, buy into performative activism, which is like just posting a black square on your Instagram. Not just, don't get me wrong, disseminating knowledge is definitely still very helpful. But once again, that's still performative because it's nothing if that knowledge isn't being applied. So tapping into these pages you've been seeing, like whether it's Black Lives Matter, the Innocence Project, People's Breakfast Oakland, and just helping out with their initiatives, whether you're giving donations, you're volunteering, and you're engaging with this content and expanding your mind from a self-educated standpoint, buying books on this matter from authors like Angela Davis, Ta-Nehisi Coates, all these great Black intellectuals. Black literature is important, y'all. This is the time to really finally get into it if you haven't before. And just get a good lens. You finally see the lens of where Black people are coming from, because I think as of right now, a lot of us are not aware of what we deal with. And that's simply because they just don't know. So I once again, please tap into to Black literature, watch Black films, watch all of that to just finally get a good purview of what we're going through right now. And then from there, use that knowledge as fuel to help the cause.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that is pretty much all the questions that I have. Again, thank you so much, Jacob, for doing this. This really means a lot, and it was definitely a lot of education for me, and I'm pretty sure for a lot of others. And it has to serve as an inspiration for coming from someone like you, for anyone who has been part of the movement to do something more, and for someone who hasn't acted yet to actually act. And thank you so much for sharing your perspective and sharing thoughts and just teaching us a lot about what all of this conversation and all of this event is all about. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad I've been able to spit out some knowledge from my perspective and, hopefully motivate people to join the movement.
Yep. Thank you so much, Jacob.